So in terms of the demographic study, you know that for the last year we've been working on that. So 2019, 2020, that was a key strategic initiative. And so this work is not something that we are moving swiftly and without thought. It is exactly the opposite. It is a deliberate, intentional process. The actual process itself is mapped out later in the presentation, so you'll see exactly where we've been and where we're headed. But on the next slide, Mr. Stovener, you can actually see the outline. So what we had been discussing was that we would update our demographic study. We need to, as a district, maintain a pulse on where our enrollment is headed and have enough foresight to be able to plan and intentionally shape the way our programs are delivered so that they are equitable across our buildings. So with that foresight in mind, we were able to understand where our district is headed and develop 10-year projections, and then look at building capacity and so forth to understand, the story of our district. And so this year, our focus is to take a look at the scenarios that are developed, and this evening we'll be sharing 2 scenarios with you as a part of this presentation. The dialogue around those will be on October 19th at a dedicated committee meeting where we can really delve into what that means and the implications under each of those 2 scenarios. And then finally, this will remain a key strategic initiative as we enter into next year, 21-22, as we will be working on making sure the transitions and the implementation of those developed plans are as smooth as possible. So if we go to the next slide, looking at the background of our district, it's not something that you would think. However, our steady enrollment across K-12 is something that we're seeing. So it has not been projected to increase in a drastic form. However, we're seeing movement within our population. So within the Wexford catchment area, what we do know is our enrollment is increasing drastically due to a lot of move in and so the in-migration numbers are up, the new construction that is there that is being filled out, where we have folks who are aging in place essentially and not selling their homes, and they enjoy our communities are staying here on the opposite side. So in essence, what we've seen is the shift of our population from what had been a larger population in Richland now over in Pine. So this east to west shift. In terms of our capacity, like we mentioned, we want to make sure that we're delivering our programs in the spaces that they're designed for. So all of that leads into looking in the next slide, kind of what I just discussed, the story of seeing where our population is most dense. And you can see that there are concentrated areas in the bottom right corner of this image. You can see kind of the Grandview area, and where we have some denser populations within our community and some of those planned neighborhoods that are producing a lot of our students as well. But this is, looking at overall population density. So on the next slide, you can see where we actually took a look at those 10-year projections to see where our enrollment would be. The year that we want to keep an eye on and that I'm using to compare our everything to in terms of these models is 23-24, where we see the peak enrollment within the district. So as you're thinking through the models where we're projected to be, if we were to continue on the path that we are in, the number of sections that we would need to have in Wexford to accommodate that population would exceed the facility's capacity to hold those sections, and most certainly would impact our programs. So the time to act is now to next year be able to shift our student populations around. And you'll note that while we had this process underway starting last year, we took an intentional pause knowing that we had a global pandemic in the background, and we needed to focus on reopening schools and helping families become adjusted to the new routines that we were in. And now we are resurfacing this topic so that we are able to maintain our planning and our careful thought so that we don't end up in a position where we're unable to deliver programs as intended. So on the next slide, you will see the facility capacity and the current utilization. So we have our largest facility as Richland, and it's not currently weighted. If you look at Wexford's facility space and how it's currently being utilized, we're not optimizing the space that we have, and our population will continue to grow there. The ideal is not to have all of your buildings at 100%. We need to have room to grow into them and to understand what that will look like. So even within the design of the scenarios, within the first year of our redistricting, that is not going to have us sitting exactly where we will be come 2024, when we will be at that peak, if you will. So an example of that would be straight across from this campus, we have Laurel Grove, a new plan that is just beginning to become populated, and there are plenty more homes and spaces residentially that are on the books for there. So walking through this process, we wanted to make sure that before we got to this point where we were even introducing the concept of scenarios, that we had all developed a common philosophy. So in times across our committee meetings in the past, we looked at those criteria. So on the next slide, you'll note the criteria that we had determined were important to us. And so what could we consider and what should we share with the demographers as considerations while they were developing the scenarios that we were able to put forward. So obviously, we want to do this with the 10-year projections in mind. We don't want to be coming back to this fewer than 5 years away. We would hope that this would last further into the future, and every indication of the enrollment projections we have now are certainly leaning that way. We want to understand where we have neighborhoods that we could possibly reunify. You will see an example of that tonight. We mentioned Grandview just a few moments ago. That is an example where we are able to actually utilize this to reunify some areas. And the most important part on this slide is that we did not want to introduce more scenarios than were necessary. They needed to be based upon these criteria, and we don't find it beneficial or healthy to pit scenarios against one another, neighborhoods essentially against one another, where it's not a viable option that actually gets us to a place where the enrollment is optimized across time. So we took all of that into consideration, and so developing those criteria prior to engaging the process, which is on the next slide, of really developing those scenarios is where we wanted to be. So you can see here that the work really began understanding what the capacity and the studies looked like, moving through the geocoding process, knowing exactly which students are coming from which homes and which neighborhoods. We have beautiful maps to share with you that have all of that information kind of captured on it. And then we were able to start working on those scenarios with the demographers over the summer, and now finally here tonight, just introducing preliminarily the two scenarios that we'll be looking at. So what we would be asking is then to come back, like I said, the committee meeting on October 19th, we would be talking about this, also potentially holding a virtual town hall on November 4th, and then asking for board action this fall so that we could begin that planning process as we get into the winter and through the remainder of this school year into next year. So on the next slide, you'll note just kind of a look-fors, if you will, and we'll take a moment to toggle between the current map of the district as well as the scenarios and what they look like. But within the two scenarios, we're calling them A and B. There is no notation of which one is preferred in A or B. These are just simply two scenarios. You'll note that there are differences among them, and these will be things we'll consider when we come together on the 19th. So in scenario A, as we'll see, the northwest region of Wexford becomes Richland. So this, again, when we have the visual, will become a little clearer. Grandview, as I mentioned, is reunified. That does happen in both scenarios. We have a smoothing of the boundary in both scenarios between Richland and Hants, and that was, there's a line you'll see kind of arbitrarily drawn in the past, which is our current boundaries we use since 2012, that we were able to, there really weren't students in those zones, but we were able to make that line make a little more sense in terms of where it is drawn. And then also looking at what the Wexford and Hants boundaries do in each of them. So the biggest differences between the two models are bullet points 1 and 4 under each A and B scenarios. So in the B scenario, that northwest region remains the Wexford zone, and you'll notice that the boundaries between Wexford and Hants do shift slightly west. So we'll go ahead and look at the actual boundaries on the of what that looks like since 2012. And so just kind of take a moment and capture in your mind that Wexford is running north-south, if you will, in the orangish color. Hants, you'll see in the bottom right there in the pink, and Richland in the green. And it's certainly the largest area within this map, but you'll notice kind of the jagged boundary between Richland and Hants that I was referring to, and somewhat of like a finger pointing down, if you will, if you use your imagination, kind of on the line there where Grubbs Road is. And so thinking through, why that was there aren't students actually within that zone, so being able to smooth some of those things out makes a little bit more sense. So with that being said, let's look at scenario A. So you'll notice, again, most evident here is that Richland is now running more east to west, and what was the north-south kind of parameter of Wexford has now stopped running so far north, and that boundary is maintained between Wexford and Hants as it is. again, you'll notice that over on the far side of Hants, that the Grandview plan, which was previously, that line had been a little bit lower further south, where there was actually some of Grandview attending Richland and some of Grandview attending Hants. This will provide that neighborhood with, again, unity and the sense of neighbors being bused together. It's come up over the years with folks who are trying to transport children and relying on neighbors, et cetera, that requests happen that way. You'll also notice things like in the Wexford area that the line has dropped a little bit further south as well, even as you get to the further east portion of the Wexford zone. So there are certain plans within the district that have very high levels of students, particularly in K-3. So all of that, we can get into those details on the 19th, but you'll note some of those differences. So looking at what that means in terms of the enrollment projections, we have a map of the numbers on the next slide that indicate where enrollment is. And as I mentioned, 2024 is the number that we want to be looking at to see where that peak hits, and then what that means in terms of number of sections on an average basis, as well as the ability for the building, the facility to absorb those and actually house them in a good way. So you can see it's broken down for Hants, Richland, and Wexford. We'll give you time, obviously, to take that in, but we've done things, again, in the background so that we can discuss on the 19th what that does to the loadings of the buildings, et cetera. So that's just to give you a sense of what that would look like. Now, to refresh your memory on the current boundaries, we inserted that slide one more time so that you can get that visual in your mind. So again, we're looking at Wexford being north-south currently. You're going to notice that in the next version, in scenario B, it maintains that north-south, and instead we're actually looking at taking what is the eastern Wexford boundary and pushing it further west. So Hants ends up taking up a little bit more of that space, and you do notice a little bit of a shift in the northeastern region of Wexford. There's a slight bend in that line where then that becomes Richland. Again, with Richland being the most populated school, the idea here is we need to shift students. And so that is Wexford to Richland, Wexford to Hants, Wexford to Richland, but then that makes Richland go to Hants. So there's multiple pieces of impact based on this. So, okay, take that in your mind again. And then we'll move to that scenario B. And you can see that Grandview is, again, reunified with that boundary line pushing a little further north. You can also see that what I just described between Wexford and Hants, where the boundary has now shifted further west, and we do see a larger portion on what is the western side of Richland in this that has become a part of that new zone. So then on the next slide, you can see, again, enrollment projections. The one piece that's important to remember here, as this column is called current and it says 2019, what the demographers actually did was back map what those numbers would have looked like in that year, given that enrollment based on this scenario. So that is not what it looked like in 2019. You'd want to go back up to the chart above where we actually had the current enrollment and then the projections off the 10-year study. So these are things that we want to at least get in your minds for consideration, knowing that we have an important meeting and some important decisions obviously ahead of us. But this would be a first glance at what those two scenarios would be. So in terms of timeline, if you look, what I verbalized in the beginning is on the next slide, where we indicate that we'll be summarizing this meeting, obviously, and sending this out as a podcast, so that if anybody was unable to attend this meeting virtually and they need an update, they will have that. We'll have our committee meeting, the potential virtual town hall, and continued discussion with further updates to the community in between, and then requesting board on November 16th would be the board action that we're requesting. And as we say this and we share this, we're not taking it lightly. We know that now that we've said here are two scenarios, there are people who are hearing this, seeing this, and thinking, that's me, that's my students, etc. Please bear in mind that we will do this with as much intention as possible and really plan the transition for those students and really make sure that they are ushered into and supported throughout what's happening. So we did this intentionally so that we would have time and the ability to speak with the students to help understand what it'll look like as they are acclimated at a new building. So we have some ideas listed here, but that is not an exhaustive list. We have many more concepts that we would put in place to do that. So we will continue updating the website. If you've not yet taken a look at that, and either you're new to us, your child maybe is just starting school and you missed the beginning of it, you can go back to that website, and it's an archive of podcasts, communications, etc. But we wanted to at least give the community an update on that, share these scenarios with the board, and then look forward to the dialogue later this month.